In the previous video, we talked about the types of training we used in order to get ready for free sparring. Basically, we're going to talk about the methods of sparring and one other addition that I like to add into it. Stay tuned. We'll talk about it. Welcome to Shihan's Dojo. I'm Shihan Marty Husband, and I'm here today to help you build your martial arts skills and knowledge, or if you're wanting to learn more about the martial arts, tell you a little bit more about it. So if you're here for the first time, jab that subscribe button and punch that bell so we can notify you when we have a new video coming out. The question for today is, what type of sparring do you train for in order to compete or for self-defense? Let us know in the comments and maybe we can get a discussion started. As we discussed in the previous video on the types of training that is done for sparring, we covered the basic dynamics that need to be looked at when trying to study for your martial arts. If you haven't seen that video, check it out up here and come back and watch the rest of this video. Now, as we were talking, we're going to talk about the methods of sparring that are used today. 4 of them are going to be in sport, plus the one I will add because I consider it a type of sparring. Most conventional styles break down into 4 categories for sport. However, from a conventional standpoint, I want to talk about other things that should be processed in understanding what types of sparring there really are. Methods of sparring can vary from style to style or relative to the types of martial arts you're trying to use. That includes boxing, savate, wrestling, BJJ, jujitsu, karate. All of them are encompassed with that idea of sparring. Whether you're doing it for a tournament, a UFC fight, or just plain realistic fighting, the martial arts is about how we defend ourselves and utilize our offensive to take control of a situation. This is not an overall view, mind you, of sparring, because the subject is vast, and in the future I hope to cover different aspects of this and maybe break them down a little bit further. I just basically want you to remember the 4 different types that we have. The first one is probably the most common, and it's called non-contact controlled sparring. Now, in non-contact controlled sparring, it's very simple that the athletes will usually perform to control their techniques and not making contact with like the face or the groin area or things like that. Now, that's not to say they don't connect to the body. It's usually just a light touch or a contact that's done. But the kicks and punches always have to stop short of the head in order to protect the athletes and keep them from being injured. There are specific rules on targets and how the techniques are to be performed. They usually are performed to a subjective level that the judges decide are good technique or bad technique, or if they even got into the opponent. No matter what, they still use the keys to focusing, getting their distance, their reactions, their timing, just to make sure that these techniques look good. It's also an important aspect that'll help them in their types of fighting as they continue to train. Now, these rules do present a difficulty for some beginners or people who don't quite understand what they're doing in the martial arts, in that these techniques never penetrate very far if they touch the body. I think it also causes the athlete to not understand self-defense as well, although many people out there will say this is a useless type of training for self-defense. I don't agree with that. I do believe, though, that people who train in that type of situation need to be able to use bags, makawara training, or have somebody padded up, or both of them padded up, so they can understand the feel of contact. Now, the bad thing is they'll never really get a true feel for contact unless they've hit something, because even with the pads on, when you're training contact sparring, you can't feel what's really going on. Overall, this can help you, like I said, with your distance, your timing, your reaction, but it can also help you to get a sense of unexpectedness so you can learn from surprise attacks when you're fighting people you don't know in tournaments. I think it has its place for the types of people who want that kind of sparring or self-defense. The second type of sparring we're going to talk about is touch slap controlled sparring. This type of sparring was developed mostly through Chinese practice, such as Wing Chun, Chin Na, and some Filipino martial arts when they're training. Now, I'm not covering self-defense aspects here because I feel that Filipino arts really has a great understanding. Same with many Chinese martial arts have a great understanding of self-defense. This is just a type of sparring. And just to note, we're talking sporting aspects at this point. These techniques often lack power and look quite graceful. However, they are good for understanding how to come into your opponent and then better control them either by trapping them, joint locks, or sometimes takedowns. Now, some sports will not allow certain sweeps, reaps, or throws to be used in this type of a situation. However, there are usually rules that allow them to take down certain types of throws and reaps. Some tournaments I've seen that they'll allow hip throws, but they won't allow anything above the hip for throws. They'll allow sweeps, they will not allow attacks to knees. This is again to protect the athletes. So So you have to bear that in mind. Not all people who are athletes in the martial arts want to get into full contact, because that's just not what they're into. They still have to have some kind of real contact training in order to best develop their self-defense. The third one is basically known as moderate controlled contact sparring. In this instance, we begin to see that there's more contact being made, both in penetrating the torso of the opponent and sometimes hitting the head hard enough to do a knockout. In doing this type of sparring, there must be some mandatory safety equipment in order to protect the athletes. This can include different things from helmets to gloves to whatever is necessary, because it is used a lot in Taekwondo and many other semi-contact throughout the martial arts. Again, this safety equipment is only to curb the possibility of having major injuries when using this type of a fighting or sparring system. The bad thing is it still has rules, but it is more realistic for your self-defense. It's still giving you the timing, distance, reaction, the actual feeling of contact that you're actually hitting somebody, but not necessarily full force. Still, recommended would be bag training, makawar training, and other various types of striking and training that you can use to toughen up your hands and feet and understand what contact is. In many instances, these types of sparring will not allow you to use your elbows, your knees, or headbutts because of the excessive danger it can cause to the opponent that you're fighting, and can cause permanent injury if a person makes a mistake. Once a person is trying to train with this type of sparring, they have to make sure that they're also training other martial arts styles to understand how to handle them and be able to do throws, takedowns, or whatever is necessary to add on to their own system of fighting. Like the first two, I still think it doesn't give you a full feeling of what it is for street fighting. However, again, it can be iterated through lecture, through knowledge, through training outside of the sparring ring in order to facilitate a better self-defense system for them. The fourth one is basically called full contact sparring. I mean, how many of us out there haven't watched a good UFC fight or an MMA fight or boxing or whatever we like to see with these full contact fights? There are many advocates out there that think this is the best type of sparring for all types of levels. Well, I don't agree with you on that, simply because, as I stated earlier, not everyone wants to do full contact. Now, there are people out there who still have the warrior personality that want to go out there and try to see how well they do. This type of system gives them a feeling of realism and allows them to understand what it feels like to be hit. Usually the pads that are used within this are not usually as thick or as strong as the ones that are used in the controlled contact sparring that we mentioned previously. But you will see some minor equipment such as cups and arms and taping up the wrists so they don't break their wrists and things like that. In a lot of these fights, elbows, knees, again, are not used. Remember, when you see these sport fights like that, they all have rules. And that's the one big thing I have against most sports. One of the sad things I see a lot of times with this is a lot of the MMA fighters don't have the fluidity or understand their own static training and throw some very lousy techniques that could be used more efficiently if they trained themselves. Now, I'm not saying that for everybody out there, but take a look. You'll see some of the, especially amateur levels, just swing away or think that their sheer brute strength is going to get them through it. Mind you, strength will do damage, but good knowledge of tactics and strategy and understanding how to use the techniques properly is much more efficient. A coach is always needed for this type of training because safety is paramount. In this, people get knocked out, hurt, broken bones. Whatever could happen might happen. It follows Murphy's Law to a T. It's very important that a person train extra hard because of the serious natures of the injuries that can happen with this type of sparring. So they have to be in good shape. They have to be able to take a punch. They have to be able to fall or grapple. It's very important to not hurt themselves. And if you go in without some of these skills, you will be at a loss in trying to get ahead in the fight. Again, this is also limited with the aspect of certain rules. The next and final method I want to discuss is what I've mentioned several times throughout here, and it's self-defense. When you look at self-defense, there are no rules. There are no set ways of being able to fight. However, you have to train outside of those other sporting areas just to understand what could happen in the street. The first four methods tend to be not using weapons of any type that could hurt you or anything. They're usually open hand or empty hand, if you want to call it that. But in the street, there's no referees. There's no rules. There's nothing to help. So a person has to train with this thought in mind. They need to sit down and focus on the different aspects of their self-defense, because in reality this is the ultimate test for the martial artist if they ever have to use it. None of the other 4 completely get you ready for self-defense, so that's why in all of those other 4 you need to train specifically for this type of sparring. Again, you can't send a person out on the street and say, hey, try what you've learned, because they're going to get arrested or they're going to get hurt or somebody's going to do something nasty that shouldn't have been done in the first place. Strategy and tactics are so important in being able to defend yourself. One has to understand this process to a T. However, all of these methods of sparring need to be reviewed constantly, especially for the average martial artist who doesn't necessarily go into these contact types of sparring. Of the first 4, these should never be treated as self-defense. I don't care what you think about it, it's a sport that you're doing with those first 4. That's what you're training for, to look pretty, look good, and be able to win a fight. Self-defense is much more than that. It's about surviving. Now, in a self-defense situation, survival is the only thing that's paramount to making sure you get home that night. Now, these could have been broken down even further, but I thought I would introduce you basically to these types of methods so we could better talk in the future on the different aspects that I want to cover later. It's not easy for me to say which is the best, and it's not for me to say what is best for you. However, weigh what you're trying to accomplish and what's going to get you to your goal when you're trying to decide what type of sparring you're actually wanting to get into. And don't judge other people's sparring methods at all, because there are a vast array of different things that are learned when you're doing those types of sparring. As a matter of fact, if you teach somebody who controlled non-contact, if they don't touch the face and they can focus it here, if they're trained properly, they can focus it 3 inches behind the head when they need to in real life. Always remember, keep your prejudice in check. You can learn so much from many different martial arts if you don't sit there saying, oh, this is the best way to do it. It's not. The best way is what's good for you. So I hope this has been a good introduction to the methods of sparring. And if you like this, click like down there, or share it with your friends. Tell others about it so we can have Shihan's Dojo grow. And don't forget the question of the day. What sparring methods do you use for your type of system or combat training? Let us know in the comment down there any questions you might have, and we will try to get back to you just as soon as possible. And hopefully, we'll see you again here on Shihan's Dojo.